Hello, and welcome to this week's Woke Wednesday. I'm Luke Keys, and today we're going to be discussing social disparities and how it directly correlates to those in poverty. Here to talk about this topic, Maria Keys, who recently received her bachelor's in social work and psychology, and in this August, she will be receiving a master's in social work. She's also my favorite sister.
Picture a strong, rushing river. Along the riverbank, there are large, heavy boulders. Some are all the way up against the water, others are all the way against the trees, and some find themselves in the middle. But over time, the ones against the shore are continually splashed by the water from the river, while the ones in the middle occasionally get sprayed, and the ones at the trees rarely ever do. So with this topic on health disparity, I'm going to focus on those who are pregnant and their children in poverty, just to give you an example of the toll that poverty plays on their health. In one study, it was found that 65% of pregnant women who live in poverty experience at least one hardship during their pregnancy, compared to 13% of those in the middle class. And it would be remiss of me talking about this subject not to mention the factor of race. Unfortunately, that plays a huge role in the experiences of these pregnant women who live in poverty. So in one study of Medicaid recipients, highest rates of adverse birth outcomes occurred in the southeast of the United States, which, as we all can imagine, is one of the most racially separated, racially segregated parts of this country. So you can see right then and there that health outcomes are tied with this segregation. And in that same study, African Americans were 26.5% more likely to have those adverse health outcomes compared to their white counterparts in the same poverty bracket. And those health outcomes for their children included stillbirth, placental abruption, preterm birth, and other poor outcomes. What is the cause of this relationship between poverty and health disparity? So going into chronic stress, that is the #1 cause of this health disparity for this specific population. Chronic stress plays into something called allostasis, which is a biological process which is continually trying to adapt to achieve homeostasis in the plays of physical stressors and psychological stressors. So this means that an allostatic load for these women is the wear and tear of these societal stressors, these psychological stressors, and physical stressors, which is slowly breaking them down and causing these chronic health problems. This is also connected to something called the weathering hypothesis, or the weathering effect, which just means that all of this chronic stress has been found to have a terrible effect on a woman's reproductive system and reproductive health. During pregnancy, all of these social stressors that I mentioned are amplified due to a feeling of lack of control and an increased likelihood for these women then to turn to cigarettes, alcohol, and hard drug use. So this stress not only is breaking down their organs and their system, it's also causing them to reach for substances to try to control that stress. In the documentary called Unnatural Causes, experts link the inability to change one's circumstances with poor health outcomes. So if you think about those who live in poverty, that is a common recurring theme in their life, their inability to change their circumstances. And when this occurs day after day, it releases a stress response. So stick with me. 2 neonatologists tried to search for a genetic component that could possibly explain why these African American mothers were having such poor outcomes for their babies. So this leads into the topic of racial stress. So while these researchers were doing their study, they used white American citizens, recent immigrants from Africa, and African American citizens. So what they found was the white citizens and the recent African immigrants had the same level of outcome for their pregnancies. But those African American citizens had a vast increase in the likelihood of preterm birth, preeclampsia, stillbirth, and low birth weight. So these researchers were able to find that there was not a genetic component that was at play here, but instead it was the burden of racial discrimination that was causing these poor outcomes. What they also found was it only took one generation for those African immigrants. Their daughters had those same rates as African American citizens who have been in the country for years, who've lived their entire life in the country. So you can see that just one generation, one step away from Africa, one step right into the American burden of racial discrimination changed those outcomes and made them for the worse. So that brings me to what can fix this? What's the solution? So going back to my story at the beginning, do we move those boulders? They're still heavy. It would take a long time. We would have to move them one by one. And there's a chance that other boulders might roll down the hill and take their place. Or do we try to create a protected boundary between the splashes from the water onto those boulders to try to protect them from erosion and cracking? That's the question I have for you. What can we do?
When my sister brought this topic to my attention, I was posed with the same question of what do we do? That's when I heard a parable of the Good Shepherd. If you're not familiar with the Good Shepherd, it's a parable who talks about a shepherd who defends his sheep because he loves them. And whenever one sheep strays away, he leaves the whole flock to go and get that one sheep and bring it back. This related to this topic so much to me because as humans, we all live in separate cultures in this country. But in order for us to be a healthy community, we need to have all sheeps in the herd. And when one sheep strays away, we need to go out of our way as the Good Shepherd and bring that sheep back in and uplift that community.
Classics Beats.